Good morning, everyone. My name is Flavio Menezes. I'm a professor of economics here at UQ and the director of the Australian Centre for Business and Economics. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we meet today and pay my respects to their ancestors and descendants. Before I introduce the topic and the other speakers, I need to go through a couple of housekeeping items. First, you will notice we have closed captioning enabled to make this webinar more accessible to all viewers. If you like to turn this on and off, you can do so by clicking the live transcripts button below and following the prompts. Second, if you have any questions throughout today's webinar, please submit these to the Q&A and we'll address them when I come back later to facilitate the Q&A part of today's webinar. Let me briefly introduce the three speakers in the order that they will speak. Our first speaker is Dr. Kai Lee Lim, who is the inaugural St. Baker Fellow in e-mobility at UQ's Down Center for Sustainable Engineering Innovations. Our second speaker is my colleague, Dr. Andrea Lanos, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Institute for Business and Economics. And our third speaker is Isabella Darin, who is a Policy Officer at Energy Consumers Australia. Before I invite Kai to share his insights, let me provide a brief overview of the context surrounding our research. Those familiar with the Australia Energy Market Operator's latest integrated system plan will know that we will need a five-fold increase in rooftop solar capacity to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, accompanied by an eightfold increase in grid scale solar. So consequently, we anticipate a potential substantial surplus of electricity during daylight hours. I mean, if the right policy measures are in place, electric vehicles, EVs, can play a pivotal role in soaking in this excess solar generation. Moreover, through vehicle-to-grid charging, EVs could also contribute significantly to meeting peak demand, potentially alleviating the need for costly infrastructure investments. However, there is a risk that the current policy landscape will move in the opposite direction as considerations given, for example, to impose penalties on rooftop solar owners by taxing exports to encourage consumers to align their energy use with sunlight hours. So putting aside the potential effectiveness of these measures, given the existing strong incentives for self-consumption, what we truly need are positive incentives, so carrots, not sticks, to encourage households and business to invest in rooftop solar. So in essence, our research investigates whether financial incentives, specifically payments to EV owners who shift their charging behavior, if these financial incentives prove to be effective. The project, funded by Energy Consumers Australia's grant program, is a collaboration between UQ engineers and economists leveraging the UQ Tesla scope data. And you can see the full team in the background slide. And the project has two components. The first, which Kai will cover next, is a web portal designed to visualize driving and charging data in Australia. The second component, which will be presented by Andrea, is the trial and experiment that was designed to measure consumer preferences and responses to financial incentives to shift charging. The trial and experiment design was informed by industry roundtables and a customer reference group of current EV owners. Look, with this sort of brief introduction, I would now like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Kai Lee Lim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flavio, for the very kind introductions. By way of introduction, my name is Kai. I am the e-mobility fellow, the St. Baker e-mobility fellow at the UQ Dow Center. My role in this project is more on the technical side, and I've written the scripts to ingest data and to analyze data and really clean up the data so that the data itself is usable and can be managed in a very safe and efficient way. To start off to start my introductions, I would like to introduce the project. The project itself has a bit of history coming into this phase of the project that you guys are in. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. I have a few slides to just introduce it. So, with regards to the overview of the TeslaScope project itself, it was actually launched in 2021 at the University of Queensland by Dr. Jade Whitehead. And back in 2021, we've reached out to a few data aggregation platform, and then we found that TeslaScope is the analytics platform that is more suitable for our needs. TeslaScope is a data aggregation platform in which Tesla owners and drivers connect the Tesla vehicles onto TeslaScope to better visualize and manage their charging and driving behaviors. So on your right are basically the screen captures and crops of what the users can see in the TeslaScope interface. And what happens at the back end with us is that we get access to the driving and charging behaviors based on an agreement that was signed between us, UQ, and the individual participants. So in this sense, once again, it's a data analytics platform, but the question for the users is what's in it for them, in which case we incentivize them with a year's subscription of TeslaScope Premium. So TeslaScope itself has two options. You have a paid option and you have a non-paid option. The paid option in TeslaScope Premium costs about $30 a year, and it gives users the controls and the insights that you can see over here, which is enhanced vehicle controls, more details of the trips and the charging sessions, groups, leaderboards, community events, because it's a whole data aggregation platform. So you do have a lot of users all over the world, including North America, Europe, and also Australia and New Zealand. And it's constantly being updated as well, with the introduction of Tesla's solar products. TeslaScope will be planning to integrate that as well into the system. So when we get TeslaScope, we get data from TeslaScope. We get data directly from the API of the Tesla vehicle. So what happens here as compared to the other vehicle trials is that it's cost effective. You don't need to install any additional hardware on the vehicles. What you see on the right over here is basically what the participants would see when they enroll into the research program. But really, once the data comes in, we get per minute geotag logs of charging and driving data sets. And that's separated to an event data set and per minute data log data set. And prior to onboarding the participants, even back in 2021, we've offered them a survey which includes questions relating to the demographics, whether or not they have home, solar and battery, what type of dwelling they live in, if it's a freestanding building or apartment, and if they have, if that's the first vehicles or the first EV. So as of the snapshot I've taken before we went on to the holidays, this is what we have. So we have really more than 50 million records of driving and charging events combined. We've been collecting, we have data from 2018. Well, you might be asking why 2018. That's because some participants have agreed to share the historical data with us as well, including the owner-operator of TeslaScope himself, Tyler Corsair. That's why we have his historical data as well. So we have a long sampling period. The number of vehicles is close to 850 now, more than 1 million driving and charging events. Again, more than 50 million driving and charging logs. More close to 9 million kilometers distance on road duration of 15,000 days. Charging energy close to 2.8 million kilowatt hours. Total charging durations is more than close to 25,000 days. So next slide. So a bit more on the Focus project that we had in 2021. Back then, it was a bit different from this one, and really the aim was to investigate the potential of using Teslas as V2G, vehicle to grid, or more commonly known as batteries on wheels, to to really supplement the grids from households. It was a global recruitment as compared to the project that we're in. So we have recruited 409 participants across Australia, New Zealand, North America, and Europe. And that has resulted in close to 430 EVs across 15 countries. Project was funded by the Advanced Queensland and Research Grants and the iMove CRC grants, led by Dr. Jake Whitehead and supported by a PhD candidate, Ms. Tara Phillip, and myself in the technical backend. But if you were to compare what we had in 2022, with what we have now, it was a lot less. The recruitment process that we had this year was a lot more than what we had in the first year. And that was also thanks to you guys, spreading the word and, having more of your friends and acquaintances joining Tesoscope. So across more than a year, we have had 200,000 driving events, covering not as many distances, close to 70,000 charging events. We have driving locations all across the 3 regions that I spoke about. Very nice distribution across the United States, not so much in the Midwest, but a lot around the coast. Same for Australia, where you have activities happening over here in WA. A lot of activities happening in the eastern coast of Australia, on the North Island of New Zealand as well. Lots of activity happening here in Germany, and the UK, some in Scandinavia, some in France and Portugal and Spain. So that was where I had driving locations, and these information, just noting that this information is all available in the report that we have published in January of 2022, which is available in the official website of our project. So once again, with driving patterns, we've analyzed driving patterns, how the battery SOC state of charge is, the battery percentage is at the start of driving events, the differences in the regions for also the number of driving events and the distance covered, bearing in mind that we have more participants in Australia and New Zealand, and hence the higher graph. And also the time of day where the driving events started. On charging patterns, we have the density of charging events with the battery SOCs, comparing weekdays and weekends across the different regions. I'm just going to go through this really quickly because I have to introduce the dashboard as well. So, an energy consumption over here, which, back in my analysis, the mean daily energy usage for an EV in the previous analysis was 6 kilowatt hour per day, which is not very much different from turning on your air conditioning for 6 hours every night. And this is for the time of day graphs across the different regions when you're separating them up across the weekdays and the weekends. So that's the end of my slideshow. And for the next part of my presentation, I will share with you my my work, really, or the work that we have on the dashboard. So if you were to just go to the official web page that you have over here, and you notice that there's a few new links over here. So the insights that I've presented to you is found in the project report. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Tara. But if you were to click here with the EV's dashboard link, you will be brought to this web page, which is effectively the EV's dashboard that that displays insights related to all of the data that we've collected for this project. The summary over here does not change, but everything in the dashboard is real time. So whenever you get data coming in, it gets updated. This is just an overview of what we have. So these are the number of charges and drives, distance, charging energy, driving efficiency, average speed, and the different models that we have across the data set. So with the dashboard, I've separated them into a few sections. Well, the first section you'll see over here is this charger section. Bearing in mind that this is the sampling over here from July to the end of last year, right? So you can always change it over here. So you can just apply it time range, and then it will quite instantly give you the insights that you desire. Heat maps of where the charging events happen. You'll notice that this has a much better coverage than the presentation that I've shown you. So you have a lot of more coverage across the northern border. You also have coverage across the northern territory as well. We have charging counts over here, calculating the number of charges that happens across the data collection period. Fast charger use percentage. It's usually hovering around 5%, 5 to 10%. Bearing in mind that this is giving us insights that most of the charging events actually happen as AC charging events, which typically happen at home and workplaces. Total charging durations is basically a sum of all the charging durations across the data set, a sum of all the energy usage across the data set, and your battery levels as well. So your starting battery levels is depicted in the green line, the end SOC the battery levels is depicted in the yellow line. So this is showing us that most of the charging events are top-up charges. Number of driving counts, so that's just a sum of the driving events per day. Driving battery levels, how much battery is being consumed per driving event. Not very much, as you can see over here. It's mostly about 10%, which reflects a lot of the commuting events. This, bearing in mind, this is plotted per day, right? Total driving duration per day. You have gaps over here where because of the data sampling period, sometimes I might have to do a whole data refresh, and that's why we might miss some data over here, but this is for the efficiency of the real-time sampling. Total driving duration is the sum, and total trip distance is the sum over here. That is it for the dashboard. Once again, it's real-time, it gives us a summary, and it gives us the charging and driving patterns and insights of our project. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll hand it over to Andrea.
Thanks, Kai. For any other data nerds out there, that was a great introduction to how amazing our data are. So just let me share my screen and I will start. Okay, yeah, so thanks. Thanks, Kai. Thanks, Flavio. And I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners where I'm coming from today, which is Wurundjeri country. So I'm going to mostly talk about the charging trial that Energy Consumers Australia have funded. But before I do so, I wanted to paint a little bit of a picture of the the background and the context for the actual trial and the results. So we, as Kai mentioned, we're really leveraging the existing UQ Teslascope trial, which was collecting driving and charging data from vehicles, not just in Australia, but around the world. And we were lucky enough to get funding to extend that data collection to collect a larger sample of vehicles in Australia, and also get funding to provide incentives to vehicle owners in that sample to shift when they charge. And so that's the trial that I'm really going to be talking about today. As we recruited new participants into this sample, so we started recruiting new participants at the end of 2022, and we continued recruiting up until about May of 2023. We asked our participants to not just enable us to access their phenomenal driving and charging data, but also to share with us some of their thoughts and preferences about different charging incentives. So that was in our recruitment period, and I'll talk briefly about some of the insights from those surveys. Then between June last year and August last year, we halted recruitment. We had a sufficient sample, and we were actually oversubscribed. We had more interest than we were actually able to take up. So that was fantastic. EV drivers in Australia are very enthusiastic, and we were delighted with that. We're collecting a baseline period of data between June and August 2023. So we have exactly the same period of data for all of the participants in our sample. And we use that baseline data in order to randomly assign some of the vehicle owners in our study to receive rewards. And the reason why we assign some and not others is because we want to use a control group in order to be able to compare the effect of the incentive. So to compare behaviour of drivers who did receive rewards with behaviour of drivers who didn't receive rewards. And the reason why we do it randomly is it's a little bit like a vaccine trial or a clinical trial, is we want to ensure that the characteristics of those two groups match, and so that they are a good comparison group. And then in our rewards period, which was between September and December last year, we continued measuring the charging and driving of all participants in our sample, and those who were in our treatment group receiving rewards were collecting, or at least we were calculating the rewards that they received. And so our participants were informed about the rewards period at the start, about a week or two before the rewards period began. And we were paying them. We were paying them for charging behaviour up until December last year. And I'll talk more about the details of exactly what those incentives are in a second. So just wanted to quickly outline some of the insights that we garnered from our baseline survey of participants. And this is really just about their understanding and preferences and current context for charging. So this is actually just a subset of the data. It's actually the subset of the original Teslascope sample. So we asked them when they signed up again to participate in our project, what kind of tariff they use or they have access to charge their electric vehicle. So we gave them a number of options, but here we've just divided the options into two groups. So whether or not you have a flat rate for charging your electric vehicle, so the cost to you doesn't vary with time of day, it's the same regardless, or whether you have some other kind of rate. So that might be an off-peak rate, it might be a controlled load. There are many, many different options. But we found that roughly 50% of the participants in our sample, at least this subsample, basically had no incentive to charge at particular times of day. So they faced the same cost regardless of when they were charging. We then asked them whether they would consider charging. So what sort of financial compensation would they require in order to change their habits? And what we found is a really large proportion of our sample were either would actually consider changing when they charge for very little, so any amount of money, or for approximately 25% of their charging costs. So on average, we would say that participants in our sample were interested and willing to consider shifting when they charge in order to receive rewards. And then we also asked the participants in our sample whether they were aware and or interested in available tariffs. So this was at the start of 2023, so during our recruitment period, in tariffs that were available for electric vehicle owners at the time. And we found that the biggest cohort in our sample were aware of the tariffs that were available, but were actually uninterested in the tariffs that were on offer. Some were unaware, and interested. So this group may have been willing and able and may have shifted to a different tariff. But overall, with the vast majority of well, not the vast majority, but the majority of participants in our study were actually uninterested in the available electric vehicle tariffs. So that suggests to us that there is potential for providing incentives to electric vehicle owners to shift when they charge. And that, as Flavio outlined, is in the interests of those consumers if they can gain access to cheap charging for the electric vehicles, but also in the interests of all consumers and the efficiency of the electricity market as we move to a grid that is dominated by solar generation. So to test whether or not we can actually shift when people charge using pretty simple incentives, we designed a trial to try and, first of all, as I say, test whether and how much incentives will shift electric vehicle charging away from peak times. And we'll talk about exactly what we defined as that in a second, and towards these times where we expect, well, both increasingly that we will have an excess of solar generation, certainly as we get a higher penetration of solar onto the grid. And then second, we wanted to investigate whether different subgroups in our sample were more or less responsive to those incentives. So in order to do that, we designed two types of incentives. And those incentives are targeted at those two periods that we want to change charging. So first of all, we want to increase charging during what we're calling the sun soak period. So we've defined a period between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. So people receiving rewards who do not have rooftop solar at home, those people were paid in our trial 20 cents per kilowatt hour for any charge, so measured in kilowatt hours, that exceeded their baseline. So this baseline we determined using their baseline data. So each individual had their own baseline, and they're essentially paid 20 cents a kilowatt hour for a charge exceeding that baseline. So you can think of this as being paid to change your habits if this baseline accurately represents consumers' habits. And the second incentive, which we paid to both vehicle owners in the treatment group who had solar and did not have rooftop solar, is that we paid them 20 cents per kilowatt hour for charging below their baseline. So if they charged less than they used to charge during this period, 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., they were paid 20 cents for each kilowatt hour that they did so. So they were the incentive that we provide. And earlier I mentioned that we provided incentives to just a subset of our sample. So overall, we have a lot of solar participants in our sample, which is probably not surprising for those of you who know or who are electric vehicle owners. A lot of electric vehicle owners do have solar. So in our sample, we have 125 vehicles who are in our control group, so not randomly allocated to receive rewards, and 123 who were randomly allocated to receive rewards. In fact, we had 125 and then 2 participants dropped out of the trial. And in terms of non-solar participants, we have 70 in the control group and 70 in the treatment group. And just as a reminder, non-solar participants in the treatment group get both the sun soak and the peak reward, and solar participants in the treatment group just get the peak reduction reward. And we provided the incentives over approximately this 3-month period between September and December. Okay, so the first snapshots of the data that I'm going to show you are from the pre-trial charging period. So what I'm plotting here is sort of average consumption for non-solar vehicles in our sample. So vehicle owners who do not have rooftop solar, and we know that from the survey data. On the y-axis is charge measured in kilowatt hours, and the x-axis is hour of the day. So this is midnight and this is 11 p.m. And what we're plotting here is our best estimate of the average charging of a group at each hour of the day. So in blue, we have the treatment group, and in gray, we have the control group. And the reason why it's this shaded area is just to reflect the uncertainty that we have, the variability in the underlying data. So you can see that the treatment group, their charging was a lot more variable during evening times. But what's important in this picture is that these two lines, so the blue shaded area and the gray shaded area, are pretty much on top of each other. And that's due to randomization. So in the pre-trial period, we essentially have two groups that almost look identical to each other. And that's exactly what we want from our randomization. You also see that there are sort of two peaks sort of overnight, and then there is a peak at around 10 o'clock in the morning. But it is by and large pretty flat during the day with these two sort of small peaks. So we do the same thing for our solar participants in the sample. You can see that on average, their profile looks quite different to the non-solar group, in particular, as you would expect, and as we knew going into this, thanks to the original UQ Tesla Scope trial, that solar owners actually do charge a lot more during the middle of the day. So you can see that if I go back a second, you can see how flat that's relatively flat, at least compared to the solar owners. And once again, these two lines basically are on top of each other. So there's a minus difference here. It's not actually meaningful in a statistical sense, but basically these two groups are almost identical before we actually start giving the groups rewards. Okay, so let's now go talk about what are the effects of rewards. So now I'm showing you the same type of graph, the non-solar vehicles in our sample, the control and treatment, during the trial period. And what hopefully you can see is that we now have a lot more blue above the gray during the middle of the day, and more blue below the gray in this peak period. So recall it, these blue vehicles are being paid to charge more during the middle of the day, and they're being paid to charge less during this peak period. And that's pretty much exactly what we see occurring. They're shifting charge up, they're increasing charge here and decreasing charge during the peak period. For solar owners, recall that the treatment group, the treatment group here did not receive any incentive to change their charging in the middle of the day, and they don't. But they do receive an incentive to actually reduce their charge during peak. Now, it's a little less clear here, but I would say it's unclear, but it may be the case that the treatment group have actually reduced their charge during peak. And what we want to do in order to investigate this in a more robust manner is actually run regressions and estimate and test whether this is a statistically significant difference. So that's what we do in a regression. So what I'm showing you here is you can think of each of these numbers as being the effect of incentives on the hourly charge measured in kilowatt hours for each group and each type of incentive. So this number here, the negative 0.09, is telling us that non-solar households who received the peak reduction incentive reduced on average their hourly charge in peak periods by 0.09 kilowatt hours. This number in the brackets is just a measure of the uncertainty of that parameter. And these stars here just tell us how confident we are that this number is not zero, that the true effect is not zero. And so basically the more stars, the better. So we can see that non-solar households in the peak period were reducing by about 0.09 kilowatt hours. Solar households in the peak period are reducing by slightly less, 0.06, but this is a good level of statistical significance. So we're confident that this is not actually that the true effect is not zero, that this is a robust effect. And we find that the non-solar vehicles in the sun-soaked period are increasing by about 0.09. Now, we're not as confident, but this is still a decent level of statistical significance. And so we're confident to say that that is an increase in charging for the non-solar group during the sun-soaked period. Now, this is just one regression, and this is one regression using a lot of observations, including the early UQ Tesloscope trial data that was being collected by Jake Whitehead and Kara Phillip and Kai before the UQ Charge EV project. So to ensure that our results are robust, of course, we do many, many things in a peer-reviewed paper, but just to give you a glimpse of how robust these results actually are, we can restrict our sample to just being 2023. We can also restrict our sample to just being between July and December in 2023. And what's really nice to see is as you move across these columns, there are only actually pretty minor differences in the number, in the coefficient. And those differences are certainly not statistically significant. What we do see is a slight reduction in the number of stars. So that's sort of the confidence we have that the true effect is not zero, but that's exactly what we'd expect when we're actually reducing our sample by more than half. So overall, I would say that these are very strong and robust effects that we're detecting. Okay, so we found that the incentives that we provided, 20 cents a kilowatt hour to change your charging relative to your baseline, have pretty robust effects on charge. The next question we wanted to ask is whether those effects differ for different subgroups in our sample. So we have some characteristics of the vehicle owners in our sample that we collected during the survey. And so that's what we're showing here. We divide our sample up into smaller groups and then see and perform a statistical test whether the effect of incentives is the same for those two groups or different. And so here, for example, for those non-solar households, the effect of sun-soak rewards is the same regardless of whether that vehicle owner is above or below the age of 45, which is the median age in our sample. So by and large, we find that the rewards have pretty similar effects. We do find two statistically significant differences, and that has to do with how much experience the owner has with the vehicle. So we know how long our owners have had their vehicles. And we also find that those with higher income, we also find a statistically significant effect. But by and large, the effects don't differ too much across the characteristics that we have access to. Okay, so I've told you some numbers and I've told you whether those numbers differ, but I haven't given you a lot of context for how large these numbers are and whether we should really care about them and how meaningful they are. So to give you a bit of context, these are the pre-trial charging shares. So what does that mean? Well, in the baseline period for the solar vehicles, for vehicle owners who have rooftop solar, 0.42 or 42% of their charging was during the sun-soaked period and 25% for the non-solar group. So that's what these numbers are showing you. So for the peak period for solar owners, 12% of their baseline charge was occurring during peak times, and for non-solar owners, about 20% of their baseline charge was occurring during peak hours. Now, one thing that we wanted to do in order to provide context and to understand the potential impact of the research that we're undertaking is to understand how the information that we're providing through this trial differs to what people in the industry expected. So we collected survey data. We publicized, you may have seen my many, many posts on LinkedIn about this survey. We asked industry experts to share with us their beliefs about how much charging is occurring at different times of day. So what we can do is then compare, okay, well, what is our data telling us relative to what industry expected the correct answer was, or what our data would tell us. So that's what I put up on this slide. So these are the actual shares I just showed you before. So 42% of solar vehicle owners of charge occurs during sun-soak period for those who have solar in our sample. And you can see that that's not too far off the industry prediction that we collected during this survey. Similarly, you can see that for the non-solar group, the industry prediction which was 28%, was not too far off the actual truth in our sample, which was 24%. But what's curious is actually that the respondents in our sample pretty consistently overestimated how much of charge is occurring during peak time. So that's the period of 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. So in truth, the solar vehicle owners in our sample were only charging about 12% during peak times. Industry expected that to be about a third of their charging occurring during that time, and similar for non-solar households. The truth was 18%, and industry expected that to be 36%. So I guess in terms of context, that tells us that our data are actually providing pretty new information that should dramatically change how people think about electric vehicle charging. The other thing we can do, or that we asked the participants in our survey, is to predict the results of our trial. So we wanted to also understand is this trial providing new information in terms of the potential effect of incentives on charging behavior. And so that's what I've put here. So for in the gray are the actual results of our trial. So the numbers I told you before, the 0.09 reduction in average charge for the non-solar group during peak periods is about between a 20 and 26% reduction in charge during that period. So if we just, and we've got that range for each of these potential estimates. So for each of the incentives that we provide and each of the groups, what we're seeing from the results of our trial is about a 25% shift. So the incentive to increase sun-soaked charge is increasing charging by about 25%, and the incentive to reduce peak charging is approximately 25%. A little bit higher and more reliable for the non-solar households than the solar. Now, if we compare that to what's in the black, which is what we collected from our industry survey, in fact, once again, the expectations or predictions of our respondents are not too bad in terms of the effect of increasing charging in the sun-soaked period. But what we do find is that our industry respondents are drastically underestimating the potential to reduce peak charge just purely by paying people to reduce their peak charge. So we think that that's an interesting data point in that it tells us how we might be changing industry expectations. So just as a summary, before I hand over to Isabella, first of all, we found that electric vehicle owners say they're willing to shift when they charge, but they weren't interested, at least in early 2023, and tariffs have certainly changed since then. They weren't interested in the tariffs that were on offer at the time. We also found that incentives to reduce charging at peak times and increase charging during sun soak or solar producing hours are effective, in fact, very effective. So once again, in case you missed it, the incentives are changing charging by about 25%, which is a pretty massive number. We also found that the effects are fairly similar across most subgroups, at least those subgroups in our sample. So we have a relatively homogeneous sample anyway because of the nature of the electric vehicle owner population. And then finally, we found that electric vehicle owners actually use less during peak times than our industry survey respondents thought that they did. And in addition to that, our electric vehicle owners are more responsive to peak reduction incentives than industry expected them to be. So as I hand over to Isabella, I might just leave next steps for potential Q&A because I think we might be getting close to time. I just wanted to once again say thank you so much to all our electric vehicle owners who participated in the study and who were enabled this research. We couldn't have done it without you.
So I'm Isabella. I'm from ECA. I lead our work on EVs. But I thought I'd just start in case you don't know who ECA is. We were established in 2015 by the Council of Australian Governments to be the national voice for households and consumers in the energy industry. As you can see there, we're an independent, evidence-driven organisation working to ensure consumers have their values, expectations and needs met through modern, flexible and resilient energy system. So obviously why I'm here today, in addition to doing our own research, we also fund grants. We have a grants program that funds high quality research and advocacy initiatives. And I thought I'd also mention, in case you're in Sydney next week, we also have an annual foresighting forum, bringing together government, consumer advocates, industry and researchers to consider important energy issues and discuss how everybody can benefit from the energy transition this year. So why our interest in EVs at ECA? As everybody I'm sure is aware, EVs are having an increasingly prominent place in the lives of Australians and our energy system as it transitions. Certainly this has been recognised by federal and jurisdictional governments in their emissions targets for 2050, as well as forecasting for the makeup of our future energy supply, as Flavio mentioned with ISP. From our perspective, the good news is that electric vehicles benefit not only people that use EVs, but also all energy consumers. We undertook research last year to understand these potential benefits and impacts on consumers' bills, which found that it doesn't just reduce individuals' bills, as you can see on this graph, but through better network utilisation can also reduce everybody's energy bills. So as you can see, by 2050, that has about annual savings of $500 for all energy consumers and about $1,500 for individual EV users. But as we already know or has been mentioned, there still remains industry concern about the impact of electric vehicles on the energy grid if people are primarily charging at times of peak demand. So that's why we see this research as so important to contribute to that evidence base and further our understanding of charging behaviour and consumers' willingness and to shift when they charge. I thought in terms of a reflection, I would consider sort of a key enabler of shifting when you're charging. For consumers, we know obviously that through this research that people will shift, but the likelihood, to further increase this likelihood, there's sort of there's industry assumptions about automation and consumers' willingness to be involved and accept that control of their devices. As you can see here, it's really important to sort of center the consumer experience when designing these services to ensure their success, because for consumers in Australia and overseas, maintaining control of their devices continues to be a priority for consumers. Research that was building on another grant that we fund at Monash University found a trend that automated charging of EVs is still an unfamiliar concept for consumers in Australia, and many consider themselves unwilling to hand over management of their charging to a third party or automated service, with concerns about the system's inability to account for their daily life and important priorities, as well as having sufficient charge when they need it. This also aligns with experiences overseas, where many drivers in the UK who even have this smart capability are not fully utilising or overriding it often. For example, the scheduled settings up to 50% of the time. But I think this really shows sort of the importance of centering the consumer experience and their understanding of how they of designing for those consumer preferences and needs, because even if it seems like a good idea from a system perspective, that might not be necessarily what consumers are wanting to do in their day-to-day lives. So that's my short reflection. I think we're going Q&A now.
I would like to open the floor now for questions, and please note that you can still send your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. And what I'm going to try to do is try to answer all the questions you have so far, and I will kind of ask the questions in the order they were presented. So the first question, and Andrew, I think that this question is for you, is the question about how we accounted for participants who were already charging predominantly during the day off solar, and therefore, you know, you wouldn't expect much difference during the trial.
Yeah, I'm very happy to answer that. So thank you for the question and for paying so much attention. So we handled it in two ways. So first of all, our participants, when they sign up to participate in our project, they tell us whether or not they have rooftop solar. So for those participants who do have rooftop solar, none of those participants were offered the incentive to increase their charge during the sun soak period. And the reason for that is because they already, by and large, have strong incentives to manage their charging around those solar producing hours. So essentially you can view our sun soak incentive as trying to mimic that feed-in tariff arrangement. The second thing is, even if participants in our sample who don't have solar tend to charge more during the day, we manage that through determining individual baselines. So the idea of the experiment is basically to pay people to change their habits. So we estimated these baselines usually using the pre-trial data. So you can see that baseline as an estimate of their current habits, and then vehicles were paid for charges that were different to that underlying habit.
Thank you. And I think the second question is for you as well, Andrew. It's a question really about the what was the incentive? How did the household income affected the responsiveness of the incentives?
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously a very important one for policy. So I think before I give you the actual answer, it's important to think a little bit about the representativeness of our sample, which is something that I know comes up a lot and is a very valid and important point. So vehicle owners in our sample have a Tesla, and so they come from a very specific demographic group, a demographic group that tends to have higher income than the average or median Australian household. So while we do ask our participants their income bracket, most of our participants do come from relatively high income brackets. So we have limited scope to be able to investigate the effectiveness of incentives across a really wide range of incomes. But we do split our data at the median income in our sample. And we do find actually that people who have higher income, so higher than median income for our sample, are more responsive to the sun soak incentive, but not to the other, not to the peak reduction incentive.
Great. Look, the next question is really about the design of the trial, and the question is whether the 20-cent incentive was applied only to the EV charging or to the whole of the household consumption. I think it's an easy one for you, Andrew.
Yes. So it's applied just to the EV charging. So one of the reasons why this trial was feasible is that we did not have to have arrangements with electricity retailers or distributors to get access to the bills or metering data of all our consumers. Because we have the charging data directly via TeslaScope, which Kai articulated, we were able to target the incentives just at the charging behavior, which is exactly the behavior that we're interested in shifting. So it is just electric vehicle charging that we're incentivizing.
Look, we still have time for 2 or 3 more questions. There's a comment here from John, which I may just relate to everyone, the comment, which is really about the lack of relevant electricity tariffs in his area. But I'll then move on, which I think is there's a big question on the big question on, we kind of assume that a competitive market will deliver the kind of tariffs that people will select, and that will be, in fact, will achieve the kind of shifting that we envisage being socially optimal, right? Optimal for the grid, optimal for consumers. But that's really an assumption, right? And it turns out that, as John mentioned, there's a lack of those tariffs. I'll move on to the next question, which is not really on our trial, and it's a question about whether there's any modeling on the impact of vehicle to grid charging, and if there was such modeling, how would that imply for charging behavior and even feedback? So it's a sorry, and I'll take a little bit, and then I'll pass on to anyone who wants to answer that. But really, I mean, that's really a key question, right? I mean, we're now talking about in some sense, a passive consumer, right? Who is then making the consumer who is making a decision on essentially shifting their charging behavior. But if you superimpose on that incentives for them to become a more active player in that market by, for example, using the 70 kilowatt, even using the large battery to feed into the grid, then again, we'll talk about a more complex side of the equation, but that's also important, right? So does anyone from the panel wants to? So the question is really about thinking about how would you incentivize people then, and that's a real policy question, to charge to the grid at times when the grid needs it. Anyone wants to have a go at that? No?
I can have a little go. I think really in terms of incentivizing people, it really is about the benefits for them. I know just a few different research or work that I've looked at, talking about it isn't really effective, basically talking about the benefits to the grid with people, because a lot of them don't see it as their responsibility, basically, to manage the grid. They see that as the government or the network or someone else's responsibility. So while there are community-minded people out there that will do that for their community, I think those sort of financial benefits or how it can optimize the energy arrangements at their home, or I think there's been Arena's done a few trials about it recently, and looking at sort of that value proposition, essentially. I'm not sure if anybody else has anything to say on that.
No? Or going once, going twice, gone. All right. Yeah, look, I mean, yeah, I think it's obviously our trial was geared towards what's happening now, but I agree with I think the question that was asked was actually a bigger question and likely more important. And in fact, we have to get this right. And getting this right, as I said in the beginning, could mean sort of a more efficient grid. It could alleviate or mitigate the need for very expensive infrastructure. So yeah, it's a big question. Look, I'm going to ask one last question, and I'm sort of really well, I'm toying with the idea of asking my own question, but which the question about whether, and it's a question for Andrea, it's a question whether there have been any differences in charge between treatment and control, outside of like for example, during the night, outside the trial period, right? And the reason I'm asking this question is really to ascertain, how much of changing behavior is due to intuitively ascertain how much of the change in behavior is due to the trial, to the financial incentive.
Yeah, well, I think there are two parts to that question. So one of the reasons we have a control group is to try and understand how charging behaviour is evolving even in the absence of changes in incentives, or even potentially there are changes in incentives that would have happened without our trial. And so that's why the control group is so critical. We did actually observe, particularly amongst the solar vehicles in our household, a reduction in peak charge from the control group through time. So over time, they've been reducing their peak charge, and that may just be seasonality. It may be changes in terms of time trends as well. So that's one thing to note, and I think that's interesting. The second thing to note is that we do observe that treatment vehicle owners in our sample are also during the rewards period using less after 8 p.m. So between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. So it seems that potentially what's going on is that instead of getting home and just plugging the vehicle in and then leaving it, they're delaying when they plug it in. So we're not seeing differences from midnight to 7 a.m. So it could be that they're just choosing to plug it in instead when they go to bed. But we are seeing reductions in the treatment group in that period, 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. So that could be because they're just not plugging in. Or, for example, it could be for the non-solar households that they're charging more during the middle of the day, so they don't need to charge as much in the evening period. So both of those are possible. Yeah, great question.
That's great. Look, and I'm really sorry, but I won't be able to go through all the questions. And thanks very much for those of you who participated and engaged. But it is time to wrap up our discussion. And I would like to say thank you to the speakers, to the audience that joined us today, to the ECA for financial support, for supporting our research. Also, you'll be able to access the baseline, the final report, the EVs, and a link to the recording of this webinar in our website. So I thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.